It was never supposed to happen like this. I wasn't the jealous type. I trusted him completely, the kind of trust that builds slowly over years of shared routines, quiet mornings, and ordinary nights that feel safe simply because they're familiar. But that night, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. It kept lighting up the dark room in sharp, cold flashes, each vibration cutting through the silence like something trying to get my attention. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, telling myself to ignore it, telling myself that trust means not asking questions. But the sound didn't stop, and eventually, neither did the feeling in my chest. When I finally reached over and picked it up, my hands weren't steady. They trembled in a way I couldn't explain, like some part of me already knew I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. And when the screen lit up, the message waiting there was simple, almost casual, but it didn't feel that way at all. It said, "Did she find out yet?" And in that moment, something inside me shifted in a way I can still feel when I think about it now. First, I tried to explain it away. I told myself it had to be a misunderstanding, maybe a joke between coworkers, maybe something taken out of context. That's what people do when they're faced with something they don't want to believe. We look for the easiest answer, the least painful one, and we hold on to it as tightly as we can. But my thumb was already moving, already unlocking the phone, already stepping into a space that wasn't mine. I remember hesitating for just a second after the screen opened, like there was still time to put it back and pretend none of this had happened. But curiosity doesn't ask for permission, and fear doesn't wait for logic. The messages were right there, stacked one after the other, and the more I read, the less sense anything made. There were names I didn't recognize, conversations that didn't sound like him, and fragments of sentences that felt incomplete in the worst possible way, like pieces of something much larger I couldn't yet see. I kept scrolling, even though every part of me was telling me to stop. Photos started appearing between the messages, some of them normal enough at first glance, but others lingered in a way that made my stomach tighten. Blurred images, unfamiliar places, angles that didn't make sense, like they weren't meant to be understood right away. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it, and I remember thinking that if he woke up in that moment and saw me holding his phone, I wouldn't even know how to explain it. But he didn't wake up. He just lay there beside me, breathing slowly, like everything was still exactly the way it had always been. And that's what made it worse, because nothing was the same anymore. Not after what I was seeing, not after what I was starting to realize. First, I thought it was cheating. That was the only explanation that made sense, the only one my mind could hold on to without breaking. An affair, a secret relationship, something painful but familiar, something people survive every day. But the deeper I went, the harder it became to fit what I was seeing into that kind of story. The messages didn't read like romance. They didn't carry emotion or affection or even guilt. They felt calculated, detached, like transactions instead of conversations. And every new detail pulled me further away from the explanation I wanted and closer to something I didn't understand. That's when the fear really started. Not the loud kind that makes you run, but the quiet kind that settles in your chest and stays there, growing heavier with every second. I wish I could say I stopped. I wish I could say I put the phone down, rolled over, and chose not to know. But that's not what happened. Because once you see something like that, even a small piece of it, you don't just walk away. You keep looking, even when it hurts, even when it doesn't make sense, even when you feel like you're losing your grip on what's real. And the truth is, part of me needed to know. Needed to understand who the man next to me really was, and whether the life we had built together was as solid as I believed or something else entirely. Something fragile. Something false. Before we go any further, before we uncover what was really on that phone and what it led to, before we piece together the moments that changed everything, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next didn't just change the way I saw him, it changed the way I see everything. And the more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a secret I had stumbled into. It was something deeper, something that had been there long before that night, waiting quietly until I finally looked in the one place I was never supposed to look. His name is Daniel. For 12 years, that name meant stability to me. It meant a man who showed up, who paid the bills on time, who remembered the small things like how I take my coffee and the exact way I like the windows cracked open at night. Daniel wasn't just my husband. He was the center of a life that felt steady, predictable in the best way, the kind of life people spend years trying to build. And that's why what I saw on his phone didn't just confuse me. It unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. Because the man in those messages didn't sound like Daniel. He didn't feel like the man sleeping beside me. And the more I read, the harder it became to connect the two versions of him into something that made sense. Was he living a double life? That question didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, between messages, between unfamiliar names and conversations that felt incomplete but heavy with meaning. At first, I tried to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, something simple, something that would allow me to close the phone and go back to the version of him I knew. But every new detail pushed me further away from that comfort. The tone of the messages, the timing, the way certain things were said without explanation, like both sides already understood what was being discussed. It didn't feel new. It felt ongoing. Like I had walked into the middle of something that had been happening for a long time without me ever noticing. And then another thought began to form, one I didn't want to entertain but couldn't ignore. Was I in danger? It sounds dramatic when I say it now, but in that moment, lying there in the dark with his phone in my hand, it didn't feel dramatic at all. It felt real, because I wasn't just seeing secrets, I was seeing behavior I couldn't predict. And when you can't predict someone, when you don't fully understand what they're capable of, even the smallest detail can start to feel like a warning. I looked over at him more than once, half expecting him to open his eyes, to realize what I was doing, to react in a way I wasn't prepared for. But he didn't move. He just kept sleeping, as if none of this existed, as if the world I was stepping into wasn't real. Or had I just uncovered something that could destroy everything? That question stayed with me the longest because deep down I think I already knew the answer. Whatever this was, it wasn't small. It wasn't something that could be brushed off or explained away with a simple conversation in the morning. It had weight to it. It carried consequences I couldn't yet see but could already feel. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about our life, our history, every memory we had built together. Because if Daniel wasn't who I thought he was, then what did that make everything else? Who was he really? That question echoed in my mind as I continued to scroll, as if the answer might suddenly reveal itself if I just looked long enough. What was he hiding? And maybe more importantly, how had he managed to hide it so well that I never saw it coming? There were no obvious signs, no dramatic changes, nothing that would have made anyone on the outside look twice. Friends respected him. Neighbors trusted him. Even I trusted him, completely without hesitation. And that's what made it harder to accept. Because if something was this well hidden, it meant it had been carefully kept that way. Why did no one else see it? I thought about that more than once, even in those first few minutes. Because it's one thing to miss a detail here and there, but to miss something this significant, something that felt this serious, it didn't seem possible. And yet, there I was, discovering it not through a confession or a mistake, but through a single moment of curiosity, a single decision to pick up a phone I was never meant to touch. It made me question everything, not just about him, but about how much we really know the people closest to us. Because what started as curiosity didn't stay that way for long. It changed quietly at first, then all at once into something heavier, something harder to ignore. The kind of feeling that doesn't go away when you close your eyes or put something down. It stays with you, settles into your thoughts, and starts connecting dots you didn't even realize were there. And as I sat there in the dark, holding his phone, reading messages I didn't fully understand, one thing became clear in a way I couldn't deny. What started as curiosity quickly turned into fear. We had been married for 12 years, and for most of that time, Daniel was exactly the kind of man people describe when they talk about stability. He worked a steady job, the kind that didn't make headlines but paid the bills and built a life brick by brick. He wasn't flashy, didn't draw attention to himself, didn't have a circle of questionable friends or habits that made people raise their eyebrows. If anything, he was the opposite. Quiet, dependable, the kind of man neighbors trusted with a spare key and friends called when they needed help moving furniture or fixing something around the house. When people looked at us, they saw what they expected to see: a long marriage that had settled into something comfortable, something predictable, something that felt safe. Our home reflected that life in ways I didn't even notice at the time. It was a typical suburban house, nothing extravagant, but it held years of memories in small, ordinary details. The dining table where we had eaten thousands of meals, the couch where we had spent quiet evenings watching television, the hallway lined with framed photos from vacations and holidays that marked the passing of time. There were pictures of us at the beach, smiling into the sun, pictures from road trips where we looked tired but happy, and photos taken at family gatherings where Daniel always stood just slightly behind me, one hand resting lightly on my shoulder. Looking at those images, you would see a life that made sense, a relationship that had grown naturally over the years without any reason to question it. Daniel had his routines, and for a long time I found comfort in them. He woke up early, earlier than I ever could, and moved through the house quietly so he wouldn't disturb me. He drank his coffee black, always from the same mug, and read through the news on his phone before getting ready for work. In the evenings, he preferred things simple. Dinner at home, maybe a show we both followed, sometimes just sitting in the same room without saying much at all. It wasn't exciting, but it didn't need to be. There's a certain peace in knowing what to expect, in sharing space with someone who doesn't make life harder than it already is. And for years, that's what Daniel was to me. Easy to trust, easy to understand. But when I look back now, I can see the moments where things began to shift, even if they were small enough to ignore at the time. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single event that marked a clear change. It was more like a gradual distance that crept in quietly, settling into our routine without announcing itself. He started spending more time on his phone, especially late at night, long after I had gone to bed. At first, I assumed it was work or something harmless, a way to unwind before sleeping. But then it became more frequent, more deliberate. I would wake up in the middle of the night and see the faint glow of his screen, his back turned slightly toward me, his attention fixed on something I couldn't see. There were other things too, subtle enough that I dismissed them without much thought. The way he would angle his phone away when I walked into the room, not dramatically, just enough to make sure I couldn't catch a glimpse of what he was looking at. The sudden appearance of passwords where there hadn't been any before. For years, we hadn't needed them. There was an unspoken understanding between us that privacy didn't have to mean secrecy. But then one day, his phone was locked, and when I asked about it casually, he gave a simple answer that didn't invite further questions. Said it was for security, said everyone was doing it now, and I accepted that explanation because it was easier than questioning it. Our conversations changed too, though it took me longer to notice that. They became shorter, more practical, focused on daily responsibilities rather than anything deeper. We still talked, but it felt different, like we were checking boxes instead of connecting. He was still present, still physically there, but something about his attention felt divided, like part of him was somewhere else even when he was sitting right in front of me. I told myself it was normal. People change over time, relationships settle, life gets busy. It didn't have to mean anything more than that. There were moments, though, when the feeling became harder to ignore. Small pauses in conversation where he seemed distracted, brief hesitations when I asked simple questions about his day, answers that felt slightly off but not enough to challenge directly. Each time it happened, I felt it, that quiet sense that something wasn't quite right, but I pushed it aside just as quickly, because acknowledging it would have meant opening the door to something I wasn't ready to face. It's easier to trust the version of reality you've already accepted than to question it without proof. Even the way he carried himself began to change in subtle ways. Nothing obvious, nothing anyone else would notice, but enough for me to feel it if I paid attention. A certain guardedness, a slight tension when his phone buzzed and I happened to be nearby. He never acted guilty, never gave me a reason to confront him directly, but there was a difference, something just beneath the surface that I couldn't fully explain. And instead of asking questions, instead of pushing for clarity, I chose to believe in what we had always been. I chose to believe in Daniel, the man I had known for over a decade, the man who had never given me a reason to doubt him before. Looking back now, it's almost impossible to ignore those moments, the small details that seemed insignificant at the time but stand out clearly in hindsight. They were there, every one of them, like pieces of a puzzle I didn't realize I was holding. The late nights, the guarded phone, the subtle distance, the quiet shifts in behavior that I explained away because they didn't fit into the life I believed I was living. And maybe that's the hardest part of all, not that the signs existed, but that I saw them and chose not to follow them where they were leading. Because the truth is, nothing about that night was as sudden as it felt. It wasn't the beginning of something new. It was the moment everything that had been hidden finally came into view. And as I sit here now, replaying it all in my mind, there's one thought that keeps returning, one realization that's impossible to ignore no matter how much I wish I could. Looking back, the signs were always there. I just didn't want to see them. That night didn't feel different at first, at least not in any obvious way. It was raining, the kind of steady, quiet rain that taps against the windows and settles into the background of everything else. We had dinner like we always did, something simple, and spent the evening in the same routine we had followed for years. Daniel didn't seem out of place, didn't say anything unusual, didn't act in a way that would have made me stop and question the moment. If anything, it felt normal, almost reassuring in how ordinary it was. By the time we went to bed, there was nothing about that night that stood out as important. Nothing that suggested it would be the point where everything shifted. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up, though I couldn't say exactly why. The room was dark except for the faint light coming from the street outside, softened by the rain against the glass. For a few seconds, I just lay there, trying to settle back into sleep, but then I heard it. A vibration, low and persistent, coming from Daniel's side of the bed. First, I ignored it. Phones buzz all the time, messages come in at all hours, and normally it wouldn't have meant anything. But it didn't stop. It came again, and then again, each time breaking the silence just enough to keep me awake. I turned slightly, glancing in his direction. He was asleep, or at least he appeared to be, his breathing slow and even completely unaware of the sound. It was past midnight, and his phone just wouldn't stop. That was the moment something in me shifted, though I didn't fully understand it yet. I told myself it wasn't my place to check, that whatever was happening could wait until morning. That trust meant leaving things alone even when curiosity pressed against it. I lay there for a while, listening to the rain, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, trying to convince myself to let it go. But the feeling didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, settling into my chest in a way that made it hard to ignore. There was something about the persistence of those messages, something about the timing, that didn't feel right. I told myself, don't do it. The thought repeated in my mind, firm at first, then less certain with each passing second. Don't reach for the phone. Don't look. Don't turn a quiet night into something it doesn't need to be. But another thought followed closely behind it, quieter but harder to silence. What if it matters? What if this is the moment you're supposed to notice something? I hesitated, my hand hovering slightly before I even realized I had moved it. The space between us suddenly felt smaller, like the distance I had always respected no longer existed in the same way. And underneath all of it, there was a feeling I couldn't quite name, something that wasn't just curiosity anymore. Something that felt closer to instinct, but something felt wrong. Not dramatically, not in a way that demanded immediate action, but in a quiet, persistent way that didn't let me settle back into the comfort of what I thought I knew. That feeling is hard to explain, especially when there's no clear reason for it, no evidence to point to, just a sense that something is slightly off in a way that doesn't match the surface of things. And in that moment, lying there in the dark, listening to his phone buzz again, I realized I wasn't going to be able to ignore it. When I finally reached for the phone, I moved carefully, almost automatically, as if I were trying not to disturb more than just his sleep. My hand closed around it, and for a second, I just held it there, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. There's a moment right before you cross a line where everything feels suspended, like you could still step back if you chose to. But I didn't step back. I pressed the screen, and it lit up instantly, the brightness cutting through the darkness in a way that felt almost too sharp. The messages were already there, waiting. An unknown contact, saved as a single letter, M. That alone might not have meant much on its own, but combined with everything else, It felt deliberate. I opened the thread slowly, my thumb hesitating just long enough to remind me that I could still stop. But I didn't. The conversation loaded, and the first few lines didn't immediately confirm anything I could define. They were brief, almost casual, but there was an underlying tone that didn't match anything I had ever seen from Daniel before. She still doesn't know. That was the first message that made my chest tighten. It wasn't long, didn't offer context, didn't explain what it referred to, but it carried weight in a way that was impossible to ignore. I read it again, hoping I had misunderstood, hoping there was some simple explanation I hadn't considered. But before I could even process it fully, my eyes moved to the next line. Same place as before. The pattern began to form slowly, not as a clear picture but as a series of fragments that suggested something more. There was history here, repetition, something ongoing that I had never been a part of. And then, just below that, another message that shifted everything further away from anything I could explain away. Make sure it's handled. I remember staring at that line longer than the others, reading it over and over as if the meaning might change if I gave it enough time. But it didn't change. It stayed exactly the same, direct and without explanation, leaving too much room for interpretation and not enough clarity to make it harmless. My breathing became harder to control, not fast at first, but heavier, like each breath carried more weight than the last. The room felt smaller, the silence louder, as if everything around me had shifted without moving at all. At that point, it still could have been explained as something else. Work, maybe. A situation taken out of context. I held on to that possibility because it was easier than accepting anything else. But the more I scrolled, the harder it became to keep that belief intact. The messages weren't isolated. They stretched back further than I expected, days, weeks, maybe longer, forming a pattern that felt intentional. And the tone never changed. It remained distant, focused, stripped of anything personal in a way that made it feel deliberate. I became aware of Daniel beside me again, of how close he was, how unaware he seemed of what was happening just inches away from him. I glanced at him more than once, half expecting him to move, to wake up, to notice the shift in the air between us. But he didn't. He stayed still, completely disconnected from the moment that was quietly reshaping everything I thought I knew. And that made it harder, because it forced me to sit with the contrast between the man I had lived with for 12 years and the person I was beginning to see through those messages. I kept scrolling, even though every instinct was telling me to stop, because by then, it wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about understanding, about trying to piece together something that didn't fit into any version of reality I recognized. And then, as the conversation continued, something changed again. The messages became less frequent, spaced out by something else, something that wasn't text at all. That's when I found the photos, and everything changed. The photos didn't make sense at first, and maybe that was the most unsettling part. If they had been obvious, if they had clearly pointed to something I could define, I might have reacted differently. But they weren't clear. They were fragments, angles, moments captured without context, and each one left more questions than answers. Some showed places I didn't recognize, dimly lit interiors, corners of rooms that felt unfamiliar and out of place. Others were taken outside, at night, with streetlights casting uneven shadows across empty sidewalks and parked cars. There were no faces in most of them, no clear subjects, just pieces of environments that felt deliberate in a way I couldn't explain. I stared at them longer than I should have, trying to understand what I was seeing, trying to find something that would make it all come together. But the more I looked, the more disconnected it felt. Couldn't confront him, not yet. That thought came quickly, almost instinctively, because I knew I didn't have enough to stand on. What would I even say? That I had gone through his phone while he slept and found messages I didn't understand. Photos that didn't clearly mean anything but felt wrong? It wouldn't be enough, not for him and not for me. I needed more. I needed something that made sense. Something that could explain what I was looking at without leaving room for doubt. So instead of waking him, instead of forcing a conversation I wasn't ready to have, I put the phone back exactly where I found it and lay there, staring into the darkness, waiting for the morning to come. But morning didn't bring clarity. It brought distance. Daniel woke up like he always did. moved through his routine without hesitation, without any sign that anything had changed. He made his coffee, checked his phone briefly, got ready for work, and spoke to me in the same calm, familiar tone I had known for years. If he noticed anything different about me, he didn't show it. And that made it harder because it meant whatever was happening, whatever I had seen, it was contained entirely on my side of things. I was the only one carrying it, the only one trying to make sense of something that didn't fit into the life we were living. That day passed slowly, each hour stretching longer than it should have. I found myself replaying the messages in my mind, going over every detail, every word, trying to extract meaning from something that still felt incomplete. By the time evening came, I had already made a decision without fully realizing it. I wasn't going to let it go. I needed to understand what I had seen, even if it meant crossing lines I had never crossed before. It started with small things. When Daniel went to shower that night, I picked up his phone again, this time with less hesitation but more awareness of what I was doing. I moved carefully, opening the same conversation, scrolling further back, looking for anything that might explain the tone, the pattern, the purpose. But the more I searched, the more complicated it became. There were gaps, missing pieces, conversations that seemed to start in the middle and end without resolution. And then I noticed something else. Apps I didn't recognize, tucked away in folders that hadn't been there before. Some were disguised, their icons plain and unremarkable. But when I opened them, they revealed entirely separate spaces, additional messages, different names. Fake contact names began to stand out once I knew what I was looking for. Numbers saved under ordinary labels. Names that didn't match the tone of the conversations attached to them. It was organized in a way that felt intentional, like someone had taken the time to make sure nothing looked out of place at a glance. And that realization shifted something in me again, because it meant this wasn't careless. It wasn't accidental. It was controlled. I started checking everything I could without leaving a trace. Call logs, message histories, anything that might give me a clearer picture. And then I found the location history. At first, it looked normal, just the usual places, work, home, a few familiar stops in between. But as I looked closer, patterns began to emerge. Repeated visits to places I didn't recognize, always at odd hours, often late at night or early in the morning. Addresses that didn't match anything in our routine, locations that sat just outside the areas we usually stayed within. That's when my thoughts started branching in directions I didn't want them to go. Maybe it was something illegal. That idea came and went quickly, but it left a mark. The tone of the messages, the way things were phrased, it didn't sound personal, didn't sound emotional. It sounded transactional, controlled. But then another possibility surfaced just as quickly. Maybe it was gambling, some kind of hidden habit he didn't want me to know about. Or maybe it was an affair, something more complicated than I initially thought, involving more than one person, more than one place. Each explanation seemed possible for a moment, but none of them held up for long. They all felt incomplete, like they explained part of what I was seeing but left too much unanswered. The more I looked, the more the details began to stack on top of each other. Strange addresses, repeated locations, times that didn't align with what he had told me about his schedule. Late-night visits that had no clear explanation. Gaps in his day that I had never questioned before but now stood out clearly. It was like looking at a map where certain points had been highlighted, not randomly, but with purpose. And I was only just beginning to see the pattern. Was I overthinking this? Or was I living with a stranger? That question stayed with me constantly, looping in my mind as I moved through the days that followed. Because part of me still wanted to believe there was a simple explanation, something that would allow me to step back from the edge I felt myself approaching. But another part of me, the part that had seen the messages, the photos, the patterns, couldn't ignore what was right in front of me. It didn't take long before watching from a distance wasn't enough anymore. I needed to see it for myself, not through messages or locations on a screen, but in real time. So one evening, when he said he had to step out for a bit, something about his tone, about the timing, made me decide to follow him. I didn't plan it in detail, didn't think through what I would do if he noticed. I just knew I couldn't sit at home and wonder anymore. I kept my distance, far enough that I wouldn't be seen, but close enough not to lose him. He drove further than I expected, past the places he usually went, into an area I wasn't familiar with. The streets became quieter, less crowded, the kind of place you don't pass through unless you have a reason to be there. Eventually, he slowed down and pulled over near a building that didn't stand out in any obvious way. There was nothing remarkable about it, nothing that would draw attention on its own. I watched from a distance as he stepped out of the car. My heart was pounding in a way I couldn't control, each beat louder than the last. For a moment, nothing happened. He just stood there, looking around briefly, like he was waiting. And then someone approached him. I couldn't see their face clearly from where I was, couldn't recognize them, couldn't place them in any part of our life. They spoke briefly, close enough that it felt intentional, like whatever they were saying wasn't meant to be overheard. There was no hesitation, no confusion, just a quiet exchange that felt practiced. I stayed where I was, barely moving, trying to take in as much as I could without drawing attention. But the longer I watched, the more a single realization began to settle in, one that was harder to ignore than anything I had felt before. This wasn't random. This wasn't new. This was something established, something that had been happening long before I ever thought to look. And as I sat there watching Daniel, the man I had trusted for 12 years, stand in a place I had never seen him before, speaking to someone I didn't know, I felt the weight of everything I had uncovered pressing down in a way that made it hard to breathe. Because this wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was real, unfolding right in front of me, without explanation, without clarity, but with enough detail to make one thing certain. I thought I was uncovering secrets, but I had no idea I was walking straight into danger. It wasn't just messages. It was a pattern. That realization didn't come all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, until it became impossible to ignore. Every late-night notification, every hidden app, every unfamiliar location, they weren't isolated incidents anymore. They connected in ways I couldn't unsee once I started paying attention. The addresses matched the photos. The times matched the gaps in his routine. The conversations, brief and controlled, lined up with moments he had been away without explanation. It formed something structured, something intentional, something that had been carefully maintained over time. And the more clearly I saw it, the harder it became to hold onto the version of Daniel I had known for 12 years. He wasn't just hiding something small. He was living a life that existed completely outside of the one we shared. A separate set of routines, separate interactions, separate priorities that I had never been part of. And what made it worse wasn't just the secrecy, it was the consistency. This wasn't reckless behavior or a sudden change. It was organized, measured, controlled in a way that suggested planning and purpose. Whatever he was involved in, it had structure, and that structure meant it had been going on for a long time. At first, I tried to fit it into something I could understand. Maybe he had another relationship, something hidden but still rooted in emotion, something that followed a pattern people recognize. But that explanation didn't hold. There was no warmth in the messages, no connection that resembled anything personal. It felt distant, almost transactional, like everything had a purpose that didn't involve feelings at all. Then I considered other possibilities, things I didn't want to believe but couldn't completely dismiss. The repeated locations, the coded tone, the way conversations were kept short and precise, it pointed to something more controlled, something that required discretion. The truth began to take shape the more I looked. And when it did, it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't just a double life in the sense of another relationship or a hidden habit. It was something more calculated than that. The messages, the movements, the people he met, they all revolved around a system that operated quietly without drawing attention. It looked like coordination, like exchanges that weren't meant to be questioned. Not loud, not chaotic, but steady and deliberate in a way that made it harder to detect. And that's when it became clear that whatever Daniel was involved in, it wasn't something that had room for mistakes. I didn't confront him right away. Even after everything I had seen, there was still a part of me that needed one final confirmation, something undeniable that would force the truth into the open. But that moment came sooner than I expected. It wasn't planned, it wasn't controlled, it just happened. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, his phone in my hand again, going through the same patterns I had already memorized, when I heard him walk in. I didn't have time to put it back. Didn't have time to pretend I wasn't doing exactly what I was doing. By the time I looked up, he was already standing there, watching me. There was no immediate reaction from him, no anger, no raised voice. Just a stillness that felt heavier than anything he could have said. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. I could hear my own breathing, uneven and too loud in the quiet space between us. He looked at the phone, then back at me, and something in his expression shifted, not into panic, but into something more controlled, more aware. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't know where to begin. There were too many questions, too many things I didn't understand. But eventually, the silence became too much, and the words came out before I could stop them. I asked him what it was, what I had been seeing, what he had been doing all this time. My voice didn't sound like my own. It felt distant, disconnected from the moment even as I stood there living it. He didn't answer right away. He just watched me, as if measuring something, deciding how much to say and how much to leave unsaid. And then, finally, he spoke. His voice was calm, steady, almost the same as it had always been, but the words didn't carry the same familiarity. You weren't supposed to see that. That was all he said at first, and somehow it was enough to confirm everything I had feared. Because it wasn't denial. It wasn't confusion or surprise. It was acknowledgement, quiet and direct, like he had already accepted the situation and was simply adjusting to the fact that I now knew. The room felt different in that moment, smaller, heavier, like the air itself had changed. I realized then that I wasn't just confronting a secret. I was confronting a version of him I had never known. And the more I looked at him, the harder it became to recognize the man I had spent 12 years with. There was something else there now, something that had always been present but hidden well enough that I had never questioned it. I wanted answers, needed them, but at the same time, I wasn't sure I was ready to hear them. Because whatever he said next would define everything, not just what he had been doing, but who he really was. And as that realization settled in, another thought followed close behind it, one that felt even harder to accept. And that's when I realized I was never safe. There's a moment after everything is exposed where the noise in your head just stops. Not because you've found peace, but because there's nothing left to hold on to. I stood there looking at Daniel, waiting for something that would make sense of it all, some explanation that could connect the man I loved with the person standing in front of me. But it never came. What he gave me instead wasn't clarity, it was fragments. Carefully chosen words, partial truths, enough to confirm what I already knew but never enough to fully understand it. He didn't deny anything. He didn't try to convince me I was wrong. And somehow that made it worse. Over the next few days, the reality of it settled in slowly, like something heavy pressing down in ways I couldn't escape. Daniel didn't disappear. He didn't run. He stayed exactly where he had always been, moving through the house like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Every conversation felt different. Every silence carried meaning. Every glance between us filled with things that were no longer being said. I tried to ask questions, tried to piece together something that resembled the truth, but the answers never fully came together. It was like trying to complete a picture with half the pieces missing, knowing that whatever I couldn't see might matter more than what I could. And in the middle of all that, I started to realize something that felt even harder to accept than what he had done. The phone didn't just expose him. It exposed how blind I had been. Not in a careless way, not because I ignored obvious signs, but because I trusted completely. I believed in the life we had built without questioning the parts that didn't quite fit, without following the small doubts that surfaced and disappeared just as quickly. I chose comfort over curiosity, certainty over uncertainty, and in doing that, I missed the truth even when it was right in front of me. There was no dramatic ending to it, no single moment where everything resolved cleanly. Instead, it unraveled slowly. Conversations that led nowhere, tension that never fully broke, a distance that grew wider no matter how much I tried to close it. And eventually, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit from the beginning. This wasn't something I could fix. It wasn't something I could fully understand. And it wasn't something I could continue to live with, not without losing a part of myself in the process. He never touched me, never hurt me in a way anyone else could see. There were no bruises, no raised voices, no moments that would make someone on the outside step in and say something was wrong. But everything we built was a lie. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but over time in ways I didn't recognize until it was too late. The life I thought I had, the man I thought I knew, it had all been shaped by something I was never meant to see. Even now, there are things I don't fully understand. Pieces of that night, of those messages, of the patterns I uncovered that never came together in a way that felt complete. And maybe they never will. Maybe some truths aren't meant to be fully known, only discovered in fragments that leave more questions than answers. To this day, I still don't know who Daniel really was. And that might be the hardest part of all, not the betrayal itself, but the uncertainty that remains long after everything else has fallen apart. Because sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we know the least. Not because they hide everything perfectly, but because we don't always look as closely as we think we do. We trust, we assume, we fill in the gaps with what feels right instead of what is real. And most of the time that works. Most of the time it's enough. But sometimes it isn't. And that leaves one question I still think about even now. If you were in my position, if you heard that phone buzzing in the middle of the night, if you felt that quiet sense that something wasn't right, would you have opened the phone? I've replayed that night more times than I can count, going over every detail, every decision, every moment where I could have chosen differently. And no matter how many times I think about it, I always come back to the same place, the same questions that never seem to have clear answers. What was really going on behind those messages, behind those late nights, behind the version of Daniel I thought I knew? Was it simply betrayal in a form I didn't recognize at first? Or was it something deeper, something more complicated than I was ever meant to understand? Because even now, with everything I saw, everything I uncovered, there are still gaps that don't fully close, still pieces that don't fit together in a way that feels complete. And maybe that's what stays with me the most, not just what I found, but what I didn't. The uncertainty, the unanswered questions, the quiet realization that some truths don't come with clean endings. They linger, they follow you, they change the way you look at people, at trust, at the small things you once overlooked without a second thought. It makes you wonder how many other stories exist just beneath the surface of ordinary lives, hidden in plain sight, waiting for a moment like that, a single decision, to bring them into the open. So now I want to hear from you. What do you think was really going on? Was it betrayal? Or something worse? Let me know in the comments, because your perspective might be different, and sometimes the way others see it can reveal something we might have missed. And if you think this story was disturbing, if it made you question even one thing about trust or the people around you, then wait until you hear what happened in the next one. Some stories don't just stay with you, they change the way you see everything that comes after. Subscribe for more real stories that will make you question everything.